Now, we are currently standing in Chambers Street, at the beginning of Chambers Street, and next to me is George IV Bridge. So we've got the National Museum behind me, just so people can get their bearings, because the map isn't on at the moment. Okay, I'm going to turn us round now. We are on George IV Bridge, and as we walk along here, it doesn't look like a bridge. Everything's built as if it's land level. But one of the streets that was taken away, I'm going to tell you about when we get towards the end. So first of all, I'm going to kind of start off with, execution and torture. So I was standing at the Museum of Scotland, and in there you will be able to see examples of what I'm about to talk about. Now, in the 1500s, James Douglas introduced the Maiden to Edinburgh. Now, the Maiden was a beheading machine. She was able to be flat packed. She could be disassembled and reassembled very quickly. Before we used the Maiden for nobility, we would use a sword or an axe, but unfortunately those were not always the best. It didn't always happen with one blow. Sometimes it could take several, and with Mary Queen of Scots it took several blows and a little bit of cutting at the end. So the Maiden was an advance in the process of executions and making them cleaner. She had a big lead weight and a slanted blade, so it was pretty much guaranteed, boom, it's done. IKEA execution style, exactly. Now, James Douglas, who introduced the Maiden, received a kiss from the Maiden himself on the 2nd of June 1581, and the reason he was executed was he was implicated in conspiring to murder Lord Darnley. That was Mary Queen of Scots' second husband. Yes, so he introduced the Maiden, and then he felt the kiss of the Maiden. Now, as we look here, we're looking at Parliament Hall. So the big windows you can see at the far end. Underneath the big windows, though, you can see another set of little windows. Well, they're still big, but that's the Lay Hall or the Low Hall. And that is where the Maiden used to be stored when she wasn't in use. So that's where we kept the Maiden, underneath Parliament Hall. There you are. Now, remember I said there were some streets here. Now, in this area was Old Bank Close, and the Lord President of the Court of Session actually lived here, George Lockhart. Now, he lived in Old Bank Close. But there was a man called John Cheesley, and he lived in Dalry. So if we were to go left at the lights here, it would take us to Dalry. And he lived there. No, the Maiden is actually on display in the Museum of Scotland, along with thumb screws, etc. So you can actually go and see her. She's still there. So yes, so John Cheesley, he lived in Dalry. And he was very rich. He was a very good businessman. He was also a bit of a brute, a womanizer, and very much an absent husband. He was also the father of 10 or 11 children to his wife Margaret. Now, there's a bit of a debate over the 11th child, we're not sure, so 10 or 11, okay? And then one day he decided that he no longer wanted to be burdened with all these children and this wife. Now, yes, so he decided to divorce his wife. Now, when he decided to divorce his wife, the case came up in front of George Lockhart, the Lord President. He was a very experienced man in the legal system, and he found in favour of the wife. He actually awarded her £93 per annum. Now, £93 per annum doesn't sound that much, but in those days, back in the 1600s, that was equivalent to about £80,000 a year today. Now, Cheesley was really not a happy bunny, and he actually wrote a letter to George Lockhart saying that he desired a speedy remedy, else he would attack him in kirk or market. In church or market. Now, George Lockhart, like I say, was very experienced, and he'd had all the threats thrown at him over the years and didn't really pay much attention to it. And then eventually Cheesley disappeared. He hadn't been heard from for a while. Now it comes to Easter Sunday, and that was the 31st of March 1689, and George Lockhart was going to attend the Easter Sunday service at St Giles. Now his wife was ill and she couldn't go, so he left Old Bank Close, and he bumped into a gentleman on the way to the church. He kind of vaguely recognised the face, but you know, you're not sure who it is, you can't place them, so you do the niceties, hello, good morning, that kind of thing. So he went into the church to attend the service. Now he lived just where the scaffolding is, that's roughly where the close was. Now, on the way back from the church, George Lockhart realised that he was actually being followed. And as he came towards the entrance of his close, so a close is a dead end, so it's the entrance to the doors or the staircase at the back of the building, a narrow entrance. So he walked, as he came to the entrance, he started to run. And at that point, Cheesley started to run, chased him into the close and then shot him in the back at his front door. Now his wife, Lockhart's wife, had heard the kerfuffle. She came down the stairs from her sick bed and tried to drag her husband into the house, but he was dead. Now Cheesley didn't run away. He just simply walked out of the close, and to the gathering crowd in the street, he announced, I have taught the Lord President how to do justice. So his idea of justice, he killed him because he didn't get his own way. So yes, now, he was arrested, as you can imagine, because he didn't try to flee. He just he was arrested. He was taken to the toll booth where he was tortured. Now, when he was tortured, they used thumb screws and they used the boot. And the reason he was tortured is they had to ensure he was working alone and that it wasn't a political assassination, because George Lockhart was the Lord President of the Court of Session. And it was found that, yes, he was working alone and that he was found guilty, where he was executed at the Market Cross. Now, the way that they did this was they cut off his right hand, the hand that had pulled the trigger. They then hung the pistol that he'd shot him with around his neck on a metal chain, and then they hanged him at the gallows. Now, so he was hanged at Galilee. His body was then displayed on the west port, the west gate. So that's the main entrance to the city from the west. Now, it was there for 3 days, but on the third night, the body disappeared. And to be honest, nobody was really that surprised, because that kind of happened. Relatives would come along once things had died down, take the bodies down, and then bury them. So that's kind of what happened. Now, the Lawnmarket area where we are, so you can see on the wall up there it says Lawnmarket, and the Lawnmarket runs ahead of us where it meets Castle Hill, to go up to the castle just ahead here. Now, this area, over the centuries, there have been lots of sightings of shadowy figures, missing an arm, dragging a leg. People have heard sinister laughing, footsteps coming up behind them really quickly, and then a shot from a pistol. And this has gone on and on since the 1600s. And it got so much into the Edinburgh psyche that parents, if your child's misbehaving, you used to say, you better behave or Johnny One Arm will get you. You threaten your child with Johnny One Arm. Now, in 1965, Dalry Cottage, so if we were to go straight up and turn left at the end there, Dalry Cottage was being refurbished. There was quite a couple of wee cottages there. And under the hearthstone, a skeleton was found. Now, the skeleton was missing its right hand and it had a pistol around his neck on a chain. So we believe this was the skeleton of John Cheesley. When the family had taken the skeleton down, they'd buried it under the hearth of this little cottage. Now, from that point on, nobody has seen the ghost of John Cheesley, Johnny One Arm, because when he was reburied, his spirit rested. Or so they say. But if you're walking through the Lawnmarket at night, you sometimes hear strange noises and see strange shadows. So just be aware. Yeah, I know. Can you imagine traumatising your children like that? Anyway, now, moving slightly back in time to the middle of the 1600s, so 1650s, we're going to talk about the Marquis of Montrose, who's actually, he was a Royalist hero. He was executed on the 21st of May, 1650, and he was executed by hanging at the Market Cross like a common criminal, because usually if you were nobility you would have your head chopped off, or, rather than hanging. although the way we hanged people was actually quite a quick process. It was about 90 seconds. Anyway, so he was hanged like a common criminal. Now, the morning of his execution, he dressed in a black suit with a scarlet waistcoat that had lots of silver thread in it, and he looked more like a groom than a condemned man. And he spent lots of time sorting his hair. You know, he made sure his hair was looking its best. And his jailer actually said to him, "Why are you wasting time with your hair?" And he simply said, "This morning my head is my own. This afternoon you can do with it what you will." Which I quite like. Now, for Royalists, he became a symbol of loyalty and martyrdom, as you can imagine. Just in this area where we're standing, this is actually where the Edinburgh toll booth stood. So this is where John Chiesley was tortured, and this is where heads, limbs would be displayed on spikes on top of the toll booth. But it was taken down, and now we have this open courtyard right in front of this beautiful church, which is St Giles. Now, Montrose, his coffin lay in state in Holyrood Abbey for 8 weeks before a magnificent funeral that took place on the 11th of May 1661 inside St Giles. Now, I just love this this little passageway here. It just, you know, if any of you have ever watched Natalie's Jack the Ripper tour, you can imagine shadows and things happening in this little in this passageway. It amazes me. Now, funnily enough, ahead of us here we have a statue. The buildings on the right are the High Court of Justiciary civil cases, but this statue is the oldest lead equestrian statue in Britain. It was meant to be Oliver Cromwell. Things changed very quickly, and now it's Charles II. We simply changed the head. So there you are. Now, we have another story. We're going back again to the 1430s, and this one is particularly brutal. It's about Walter Stewart, Earl of Atholl. He was executed on the 26th of March 1437 for the assassination of King James I. Now, he was the uncle of James I, and he was the son of Robert II. The assassination failed to murder the Queen and the 6-year-old James II, and the punishment for failure was swift and brutal. Now, I say he was executed on the 26th of March, but it was a 3-day execution. Now, you have to understand that back in the day, a queen is in a very vulnerable position once her husband has died, and she needed to protect her son, who was going to become James II. In the 1400s, once a woman married, everything she had was basically her husband's. So she was in a very, very vulnerable position, and she needed to show the nobility of Scotland that she was strong. Okay, so this is what she did. She arranged for his execution to take place on 3 days. Day 1, he was hoisted. Now, when you hoist someone, what you do is you tie their arms and legs to 4 ropes. Then you pull them up into the air, okay? And then you let the ropes go. But the ropes drop, but they don't drop enough for you to hit the ground. They just drop enough to give you momentum, so your body continues to move, you know, and it dislocates your joints. So that happened over and over again. He was then put in a pillory. Now, you can imagine the pain with dislocated joints, being put into a pillory where people could throw things at him and all that kind of thing. And then finally, on day 1, the final punishment was to have a crown of red hot iron with "King of all traitors" on it placed on his head. It was red hot, so it would have burned. Yes, so that was day 1. Day 2, she had him tied to a hurdle. So if you imagine like a wooden gate tied to the back of a horse, she had him tied to a hurdle and dragged up and down the Royal Mile. Now, we have cobbles today, so it would be a little bit bumpy, but back in the day it would have been very, very rough. Dislocated joints and severe burns to your head, so that would have been excruciating. And then day 3, he was brought to the Market Cross, where he was placed on a bench with a fire basket at his head, And the skill of the executioner was that he was able to disembowel him, take out his innards and throw them into the fire whilst he was still alive, and then finally end him by reaching it in and pulling out his heart. So yes, don't mess with the Scottish Queens. Now, the longest hanging we've ever had in Edinburgh took place on the 30th of December 1818, and it was a man called Robert Johnson. So just over here, roughly, we had the police station, okay? Now, Johnson had been, well, he was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and he was a big boy, and the people he was with when they committed a robbery, one of them had a gun. He ended up with the gun when they were arrested, so he's the one that ultimately paid the price for it. One escaped and the other gave King's evidence. Now, when it came to his execution, he was taken to be executed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon by John Foster. Now, he wasn't a particularly skilled man, as you'll find out. The trap door malfunctioned. Now, the Edinburgh mob were there to watch the execution, and they were kind of geared up for it. But when they realised that Johnson could actually be seen touching his toes on the trap doors, so he was slowly strangling to death rather than dropping and breaking his neck, the crowd's attitude changed, because this was, it was really barbaric, and they didn't think it was right that somebody should be executed like that, and it is definitely not right. So they took it upon themselves to storm the platform and cut him down and make off with his body. So the Edinburgh mob ran off with his body. Now, the Bailey Patterson, he summoned the town guard and the army. So the army were coming down from the castle, and the Edinburgh mob had run up that way, realised the army were coming down, so they turned around and started running back towards us. At that point, they saw the town guard coming out of the police station thing, and they decided the game was up, so they dropped the body and ran away. Now, there's a bit of a fight in the high street, but they managed to get off and escape. Now, the problem with it is that they didn't know if he was still alive, so what they did was they took his body into the police station, where they got a doctor to come and bleed him, and when they bled him, they realised he was still alive, so they took him back to the gallows, where he was executed at 8 o'clock at night the same day. So it took from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 8 o'clock at night. It was the longest hanging in Edinburgh's history. Hi everyone that's just joined, we're about. Now, just ahead of us is Bell's Wynd. Now, Bell's Wynd, I'll show you in a second once we get closer, it's where the clamshell is. Bell's Wynd has had a sort of an apparition, the White Lady, and she's been talked about through the centuries. Now, in Bell's Wynd, Mr. and Mrs. Guthrie lived in quite a big house or a flat, quite a large flat. And then one day they just seemed to have moved. Nobody knew where they'd gone, but there wasn't any reason to think there was any kind of foul play or anything. So their flat lay empty for about 20 years. Meanwhile, a locksmith had moved in upstairs from them, and his accommodation was actually smaller, and he got quite nosy and he wanted a bigger flat. So he thought, I'll go and see if I can get in and find out if it's empty, why it's empty, and maybe I'll be able to take it over. So he went downstairs to the flat, picked the front door lock, and as he picked the lock, the front door opened to reveal a really odd sight. The table was laid, it had food, the cutlery, the drinks, everything was there, covered in 20 years worth of dust and cobwebs and other stuff. So that gave him a little bit of a shock, but he steadied himself, and then he went over to where the bedroom was, and that door was locked too. So he managed to pick the lock, and as he opened the door, he saw the bed, and in the bed he could see two bodies, but one of them sat up, all in white, slipped her legs over the edge of the bed, and then walked past him out the door, but didn't touch him. And at that point he realised that she was an apparition, she wasn't real, which gave him the fright of his life. And as he approached the bed, he could see that it was two obviously well-rotted people, a man and a woman. Now, it turns out that Mr. Guthrie had been away working and he'd come home early, and Mrs. Guthrie hadn't expected him, and she had been entertaining her friend, and her husband was so angry he killed them both, placed them in the bed, locked the bedroom door, locked the sitting room door, and moved out. So yes, there you are. Hi everyone that's just joined. We're actually right at the end now. In fact, I've overrun by about a minute and a half. Right, I'm just going to turn you round. Still very warm. Any questions? And I hope I haven't upset anyone with that. It was just some of the stuff was quite brutal.